Right. Andres, to you, the introductions?
Yeah. Okay. Welcome back to the second round. I hope you had a nice morning tea. How do you go? I'm very happy actually to introduce this round because there are a few of my own students presenting here in the second session. Starting with Jinjin. Jinjin, are you online? Are you there? Jinjin?
Yes, she is.
Oh yeah, there she is. I can see you. I can't hear you. Can you just say something?
Can you say something?
Hi, hello.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you check if you're muted or just?
No, she's not muted, but no, still can't hear you. Oh, yeah, there you go.
How about now?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks.
So Jinjin makes a start and then followed by Anupriya. Anupriya is over here. And then I think we have an installation right now.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, she might still maybe turn up online, but we don't know really. Then we have our very own Marcus Robinson presenting. And last but not least, James, who I think is online as well. Is that correct, James? Well, I assume so.
Yes, yes. He responded with a.
And of course, I would like to welcome our panel members as well. We have Shannon and Hamish already sitting in pole position here. And I think we're still waiting for you, who will be a little bit late.
Yes,
correct?
yep.
Excellent. All right, so Susan, I think if everybody's ready, I think you can start.
Okay, thank you, Andres and Nata. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Xinxin. I study part-time from Auckland and working part-time at Unitec as a lecturer. Today, I'm going to present my research process because I'm in the third year of a 6-year part-time study. So before I start, I just like to thank my supervisors, Andreas and Wendy, for their tireless support and encouragement. Today's presentation will cover 4 points. First, what am I doing? So my research problem is about residential street retrofitting. As we can see in the middle of this slide, a typical New Zealand suburban residential streets, they are designed as car-oriented, wide paved spaces, as we all know. And these conventional designed residential streets have been increasingly associated with environmental and social problems, such as stormwater runoff, car accident, and thermal uncomfortable. To address these problems, people have invented various green-gray infrastructures, in particular, a new type of infrastructure, integrated green-gray infrastructure, is thinking of an innovative approach that combine the benefits of both green and green infrastructure. However, we know very little about its implementation and development in residential street retrofitting. This research aims to fill in this gap in current landscape architecture research. It will first investigate the research of integrated green infrastructure. That is what we know and what we don't know about this new infrastructure. Second, it will determine the extent to which they are implemented. So that is how many of them are implemented in residential retrofitting. And furthermore, I will also identify enablers and barriers to their implementation. So to achieve these research aims, I set up a two-phase research design. So phase one will be a systematic review. It will ensure all the relevant literature are collected and analyzed in a thorough and systematic way. Because this is a very new topic, so it's very important to collect all the data that's available so we can draw a clear picture of what we know and don't know around this topic. And the second phase is key informant interviews. So from the first phase, I will identify a few case studies globally, including New Zealand. So from the New Zealand case studies, I will choose a few to interview planners, designers, and construction workers, etc., to get a real understanding of their practice and how they are implemented. So where am I now? I am still in the first phase of exploring and developing the research protocol. Since my proposal was approved last year, I have been doing this testing and refining research method around phase one. Based on the 5 steps I proposed in my proposal, I expanded it to this diagram that I'm exploring and developing the research protocol. So for a systematic review, it's not like a conventional narrative review. It needs to develop a rigorous protocol to enable all the process are transparent and repeatable. So other researchers may repeat the same process and get the same results. So for this systematic review, I started from testing searching strategies. So the first step, I already tested searching strategies, developed searching terms, and then I also developed a set of screening criteria, set up screening priority, and did some scoping tests for screening. This including title screen, abstract screen, and full text screen. And now I'm exploring a quantitative coding process. I already tested a hybrid approach, starting with a deductive process based on the framework developed by Andreas and Wendy. And it will followed by an inductive process by adding more data. So the coding process will include coding categorization, and identify things and patterns from those codes. At the same time, I'm also doing critical appraisal, which is assess the reliability and applicability of each individual studies. And after this process, I will have a number of data and to do the next step for a narrative synthesis, including refining definitions, draw new conclusions, and generate new knowledge. So after that, I will have enough material to write reports and answer my research question. So this is where I am during my study. It's still an early stage. There is a lot to do. So over the last 3 years, there have been a lot of challenges, but also a lot of inspiration. Here is just a few challenges that I summarized. As I said, it's a new topic. There are very limited research papers. And also for both methodologies, they are new to me. So there is a big learning curve. And also it's very difficult to balance sensitivity and specification during the systematic review and search process. Sorry. And finally, yeah, remote learning also add some challenge as we all experienced over the last 2 years. To overcome this challenge, I did a lot of things. First, I tried to use multiple databases and to be more inclusive to the data. And I tested various search terms and conducting scoping tests, extensive scoping tests for each strategies. And I get a lot of advice from my supervisors and spend a lot of time to learn and doing ongoing testing and refining of each step. Then I also need more support, ongoing support in the future studies. So what to do next? So as I mentioned, at the moment, I mainly focus on phase 1 systematic review. So after I develop and tested my review protocol, I will finalize the protocol and conduct the formal systematic review using multiple databases and then write up my review report. And hopefully I will move to the next step, phase 2 study, and finish my research process. This is a brief report from me. And before I finish my presentation, I just would like to take a few minutes to thank all the support I have from the teams. First thank again to Andreas and Wendy for their wisdom, insights, and encouragement. And also thank other staff members and research students for their inspiration, especially during those seminars and conferences and also some online social network meetings. They are really important to me. And also thank Douglas behind the scene for all those 6 months report traveling and expenses and also thank learning advisors, especially Catriona. During my research proposal process, I got a lot of support and recommendations from her to improve my clarity and specification in my writing skills. And also thank librarians for giving me valuable insights for review softwares and searching strategies. Of course, also thank for NADA for organizing this very challenging hybrid seminar. That's me for today. Thank you so much.
Hi all, a very good morning to one more present here. I would like to thank everyone for this wonderful opportunity to present my research work. I am Anupriya Sukumar, PhD scholar at SOLA. My supervisors are Dr. Wendy and Dr. Andreas. I would like to thank them for their constant support and encouragement. My research topic is about developing a novel evidence-based inventory and analysis method to evaluate the existing school grounds in support of sun protective behavior that will assist the landscape designers and planners and other stakeholders in effective designing and decision making. I think most of us would have come across this popular advertisement of Little Miss Coppertone. This dates back to 1960s when tanning was largely promoted. But today, with the increased awareness and knowledge about the dangers of overexposure to the sun and its harmful effects, the efforts in the form of physical protection strategies, Sun Smart School programs have been taken to reduce the exposure and protect our children from the dangers of skin cancer. But the underlying question here is to what extent our children are sufficiently protected from these dangers. This, which is what I'm trying to answer through my research. In today's presentation, I'll be focusing on 4 key sections. 1, addressing the research gap and the need for the methodology. 2, an overview of the sun protective behavior capability assessment methodology. Then, how the methodology works in a step-by-step process. And finally, the conclusion where I'll be discussing about the strengths and limitations of this methodology. It is well established that landscape design has the potential to reduce overexposure to harmful UV radiation and help protect our children. But at the same time, studies also point out that landscape design focusing on UVR protection alone is not enough. This is because children may not be necessarily using these well-designed spaces. We cannot force children to play or use these spaces. In turn, there's a need for design that encourages spontaneous behavior, which in this study I call the sun protective behavior, to help better protect children. In other words, it is important that we design an habitat for children where this protective behavior is promoted more spontaneously. Based on the literature review, the hypothesis is that the designing children's outdoor play areas that support sun protective behavior, 3 factors need to be in place. 1, the UVR protection factor. 2, the microclimatic factor, and 3, the attractiveness. The next important question here is to what extent the school grounds are designed to support the sun protective behavior, for which there is a need for an effective methodology. And also, to achieve an intended outcome, implementation is the key. In this case, if we are to ensure that children are adequately protected from overexposure, implementing design solutions that support sun protective behavior is the key. But there is a lack of evidence-based methodology that practitioners or designers can apply, evaluate, and accordingly implement design strategies. Keeping this in mind, the 3 main objectives for developing this methodology are: it should be evidence-based, sufficiently simple and convenient for the designers or the practitioners to apply and take decisions, and most importantly, it should be able to assess multiple variables simultaneously. The aim of this methodology is to evaluate sun protective behavior capability of outdoor activity zones in existing primary school grounds. Here in this study, sun protective behavior capability is defined as the ability of an activity zone to support improved sun protection behavior through adequate UVR protection, microclimatic comfort, and attractiveness. Now I will be explaining how each factor in this study is defined. First, the UVR protection factor. The evaluation of UVR protection factor was based on the extent to which the zone meets 2 main objectives. 1, the extent to which the zone offers protection from direct UVR, and 2, the extent to which the zone offers protection from indirect UVR. The next factor, microclimatic comfort factor. The objective for this factor was developed in accordance to the New Zealand climatic zone. If the methodology is to be applied to other climatic zones, the objective needs to be modified accordingly. Now, according to Köppen classification, New Zealand belongs to a temperate zone with maritime climate. It is known for its strong winds and gust winds that are very uncomfortable for many outdoor activities. So keeping that in mind, the first objective is to provide sufficient protection from uncomfortable winds, and the next is to offer thermal comfort. Next, finally, the attractiveness factor. In the study, attractiveness is defined by the ability of the zone to offer play opportunity for the children. During recess and lunch breaks, play is considered to be the stimulating factor greatly affecting the frequency and the proportion of children using a particular zone. So the objective here is to identify if the zone offers sufficient play opportunity. To evaluate these 3 factors, I adopted the landscape unit approach. This is a very convenient and effective method used for spatial communication and largely applied in landscape planning field. However, its application into a small scale such as school grounds is very limited. This is the overall process of my methodology. The methodology works in 4 steps, starting with the first step, defining the activity zone, then moving on to evaluating the sun protective behavior factors individually, and then integrating the outputs generated from step 2 to analyze the sun protective behavior capability of the zone, and finally classifying the zones in terms of its prioritization for design implementation. There are 2 key outputs using this methodology. One at the activity zone level, using the land unit classification system, key areas that require design action can be identified. And at school level, first the sun protective behavior capability of the zones could be evaluated, and then using the zone classification system, high priority zones based on the level of retrofit required can be identified. Now I'll move into the step-by-step process. The first step is to define the unit of analysis. So choosing an appropriate spatial scale for analysis for this study is important. And here activity zone was identified as the right scale for 2 main reasons. One being because the study focuses on the behavior of children, which is largely centered around the activity zones. And 2, the activity zones significantly influences the evaluation factor, thereby the targets established for the evaluation. Next was to define the spatial boundary for the unit of analysis. Here, the outdoor activity zones were classified into 2. The structured zones, these are mostly identified through predefined activities such as the sandpit areas, the fixed play equipment areas, which are more or less defined areas. And then we have the unstructured activity zones. These are areas where children are mostly involved in spontaneous behavior. So these are the natural green areas in the school, the hard-fed areas where the children play running around. So these are the unstructured activity zones. Next was to define the boundary for these zones. So this is how I defined the boundary for the structured zone using 2 aspects, the main activity area and then a buffer area around the space. Once the structured activity zone was identified, the remaining area was marked as the unstructured activity zone. So after the spatial boundary was marked, they were further divided depending on the metabolic rate of the key activity in the zone. They were further divided into light, moderate, and vigorous activity zones. So this is how in a case study school, the activity zone was divided into 14 zones, and each was given a code. The next step is to do the evaluation of the 3 sun protective behavior factors individually. This involves 3 sub-steps. As I pointed out earlier, here I use the landscape unit approach. The landscape unit method characterizes the zone into distinct homogeneous units called landscape units, which have similar biophysical or built environmental attributes. So these landscape units become the basis for evaluation. So in the first step, is to inventory the critical variables and develop the landscape unit maps. In step 2, they were overlaid to develop the composite landscape unit maps. And depending on their level of capability, they were classified and accordingly given values. So each composite landscape unit was given a value, and depending on the proportional area that each unit occupies in a zone, the zone was evaluated as high, medium, and low for the particular factor. So this is an example here that I've shown for one zone where we have done the evaluation for one factor. So this has to be repeated for the other 2 factors for all the zones. So integrating all the 3 factors together in this step, the evaluated individual sun protective behavior factors were integrated. And using the evaluation matrix, the sun protective behavior capability of the zone was evaluated. So this is an example shown here for a school where the sun protective behavior capability of the zones was analyzed. And from this example, we could see that majority of the outdoor activity zones support a very low sun protective behavior, except for one zone which shows a moderate behavior. So this gives an indication that children using these zones are not sufficiently protected. And then the last step was to classify the zones and prioritize in terms of its design implementation. Here I use the decision tree to classify the zones based on the need for retrofitting. For this, attractiveness factor was first considered because that's the critical factor where I already pointed out that it influences the frequency and the proportion of children using the zone. So highly attractive zones were classified as top priority zones and then given a class 1, and low attractive zones into class 2. Then within class 1, depending on the combination of the microclimatic factor and UVR protection factor, it was further subdivided into 3 subclasses. So this is the table showing where each class and subclass has an influence on the design action, and accordingly the zones were prioritized for its design implementation. So in the example, these are the zones that are highly attractive and belongs to class 1. And these are the zones that belong to class 2. So in the initial slide, as I pointed out, using the methodology, there are 2 outputs. Like here, if you could see in the school level, you could prioritize the zones in terms of its design need. And then within the zone, you could look at the key areas which require the design action. So to conclude, the primary goal in developing this novel methodology is to bridge the gap between the research and the practice-oriented field for better design implementation and achieve the intended outcome, which in this case, the aim is to ensure that our children are adequately protected. The methodology was able to meet 2 main objectives. It is sufficiently evidence-based, rigorous, and convenient for the practitioners to apply. It is a powerful visual and analytical tool giving clear indication of key areas that require focus. And more importantly, it helps in easy communication for the practitioners and other stakeholders to make informed decisions. Next, using this methodology, I'll be advancing to apply this methodology to case study schools to determine the extent to which the sun protective behavior exists, and thereby I'll be answering the primary question, to what extent our children are protected. And finally, the methodology has some limitations in terms of its level of precision and accuracy achieved. Moreover, the methodology is based on a combination of methods and assumptions, so it requires further testing.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Marcus Robinson, and today I'm going to be talking about my dissertation topic, which is productive housing, exploring potential at the intersection of housing and highly productive land in Aotearoa. Firstly, I'd just like to thank my supervisor, Professor Jackie Barrow, and also support from Dr. Shannon Davis. So I like to think of this as the battle of the national policy statements. So on one hand, we've got the NPSQD, the National Policy Statement of Urban Development, which is enabling housing development through plan change requests. And on the other hand, we have the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land, which at the time of starting this research, it was actually only sort of proposed. Okay, so what is highly productive land? It's the capacity for our land to support primary production activities, and involves a range of factors, including soil type, climate, water availability, and also access to labour. About 15% of Aotearoa's land could be classified as highly productive. and it's a finite resource that we have to take care of. So what's the issue? Well, since 1996, these maps show 1996 to 2018, the urban expansion onto some of our highly productive land in New Zealand. So it's quite a lot to take in, but the light green is the highly productive land across different regions of New Zealand. The yellow is the urban areas from 1996. And if you focus in on the darker green, that's the area of urban land that's being developed on, the highly productive land that's been developed since that time. So it's quite a large amount. And if you look down at the bottom right there, that's kind of our area that we're looking at, southwest of Christchurch. So the bottom area is actually Lincoln, and the one just to the above that is Rolleston. So we're actually talking about 438 hectares in that area, which is quite substantial. I think you'll agree. So I'm going to kind of skip through the literature review stuff and get into the kind of nuts and bolts of what we'll be looking at. But essentially, we're going to be looking at what the potential is for integrating housing and food in peri-urban Aotearoa. And what was I going to say about that? Yeah, and I guess it kind of highlights one of the planning issues around this is that we have this sort of monofunctional zoning. So it's either housing or it's food production. So how do we find that middle ground? The method that I'm going to be using is following this one, the design thinking process, which is developed at Stanford University, and it goes through 5 different phases, from empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and then testing. So in my research, I'm going to be looking at in the empathize mode, which is actually trying to understand the user's the problem from a user point of view. So we're going to be collecting and coding submissions. Then we're going to be analysing those in the define mode to try and figure out what the real problem is and what the opportunities are. Then we're going to be developing some generic ideas in the ideate phase and then applying them to the site in the prototype phase. We're actually not going to get into the testing because of the scope of the dissertation, so future potential research there. Okay, so we're also going to be using a case study approach. So looking in the Selwyn district, we see there's actually quite a large number of plan change requests currently, this was in August, being looked at by the council. So the one that we're going to look at is Plan Change 69, which most of you are probably aware of. It's the one behind Te Whariki, just over the way there. So that's what we're going to be doing, and this is it here. So this is as part of that submission, they provided an outline development plan, which is kind of like a structure plan that shows, the change in zoning to the different activities. So we've got in the yellow, it's mostly residential. We've got 3 different commercial activities spread across that area in the red, and then a mix of kind of reserves in green and sort of blue and bluey-green kind of colour for stormwater management and wetlands. And as part of that submission, there were more than 260 community submissions, most of those opposing the development. So I've just captured a few of them here to do with housing and food. So it was actually kind of mixed with housing. There was a lot of people saying, no high density housing, which they were referring to the small lots and lots of small houses or big houses on small lots and a small amount of land. Some other really interesting ones, like model of several apartments with common ground, could be an acceptable alternative. So something a little bit more progressive, I guess. We need high quality, high density homes with accessible community areas and easy access to public transport. And then concern about consistency with neighbouring areas. Then in terms of food, most of the comments were centred around the protection of our highly productive land. loss of it. So those were the two key things from those. But just looking broadly across all of the submissions, they're all coded and kind of themed into different categories. So we had 9 themes. The biggest one was actually transport. So within that, some sub-themes around road safety, particularly for children going to school. Traffic was a big one, obviously the increase in traffic with a higher population. And then moving through some of those other ones like community infrastructure, you know, the ability for the entities and services to provide for that future population, given the current strain. Then obviously our environmental and food and housing in there as well. So analysing those further in the define mode, I was able to kind of pick out some ways that a landscape architecture approach could deal with some of those concerns. This also combined with some of the literature review as well. So in terms of housing, you know, how can we provide more housing variety and choice and enable higher densities? Reducing residential coverage and dwelling numbers perhaps as potential. Goal 3, utilising soil and flood mapping to maximise potential and manage risk. Goal 4, and this kind of came from the literature review as well, developing compact and walkable neighbourhoods near existing transport routes. And goal 5, retain perimeter buffers to maintain rural character and provide food and ecological corridors. So taking those through into the next mode, which is ideate. This is where we're just sort of thinking about, you know, that first goal that I brought up there. How can we provide more housing variety and choice, given that there's a lot of standalone houses? So what does it look like if we introduce some different typologies, and what does it mean spatially? So obviously the top left standalone is kind of what we're getting a lot of already. All of these use a 1 hectare site, and we've got 12 dwellings, which incidentally is the minimum number that they require in PC69. So how can we cut that differently? We could do some terrace housing, we could do some apartments over 3 floors, we could do apartments over 6 floors. And you actually start seeing the amount of space saving that you can have. So what could you do with that extra space? Well, you could actually use some of the food production. You could introduce some native restoration, or you could even, you know, just provide some recreational space for people. So then taking that further, just thinking about reducing residential site coverage, which is one of those goals, just setting up some different options. So the first one is PC69. So currently 57.5% of the sites being used for residential. But what happens if we go 40, 30, 20, and 10 as some options? And then just looking at what the density requirement would be if you use those different site coverages. I'll just break this down for you guys. So along this axis, we've got the maximum allowable units in that development, PC69, and then coming down here, we're just saying, well, what happens if we reduce the target number, just have a smaller population. And then across this axis here, we've got PC69, and then our 4 options that we put forward previously. So what density will we require to meet those numbers? And these densities are actually based on the lot and the road, if you want to get into the technical, because in case someone's like, that's not the right density. But the way that I calculated it was because a lot of the roads are actually missing off the outline development plan, they're sort of included in the yellow parcel. So I've actually included them together for the sake of keeping it simplified, if that makes sense. So you can see we're getting into some quite high densities up here if we want to only use 10% site coverage, but also some really low densities down here. So how do we take that forward? Well, I wanted to kind of narrow it down to sort of 3 scenarios. So what I did was I looked at this matrix and started making some judgments about it. So we could say that all the ones on the bottom here, because you're only getting 955 units, the developer's not really that happy with that. poor economics. So maybe we'll just take those ones out. These ones here actually really go low density and they're not going to provide that housing choice that we require because we're going to end up with the same typologies we've got already. So we'll take those ones out. And then looking at that pink one there, it's actually kind of off the scale of the typologies we were looking at. So we'll take that one out as well. So we kind of end up with this the scenarios of most potential in here and just mapping those down to, you know, we want one with 30%, we want one with 20%, and we want one with 10%. And we'll have a look at those in more detail. So now looking at the food side of things, so we've kind of got some scenarios for housing. Yeah. What does the soils tell us on the site? Essentially, there's a few different classes. So we've got class 2, 3, and then we've got some disturbed soil here. So 38% of the soil is class 2, which is all of the site would actually be considered highly productive. But if we just say, well, what are the best soils, that's that class 2. Moving into something different here, just thinking about alternative types of foods. Currently on the site, well, previously it was a dairy farm, so they're producing milk. But if we start looking at some other kinds of foods that are grown in Canterbury, and this is looking at weight only, so notwithstanding the nutritional value that might be in some of these foods as well, like proteins and things, but just purely looking at weight, you know, we could actually produce quite a lot of variety in here that would require less of the site. And just breaking it down graphically. So, you know, if we're producing milk with 100% of the site, we could produce the same weight in eggs with 70% of the site, same weight in berries and grapes with 27, and so on and so forth. So, just keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward. Also, some of those goals we're looking at is site analysis. So, what is the site telling us about what we should do with it? We already looked at those class 2 soils, but there's also some flood risk areas. So high rainfall events, some of that area is prone to flooding. We also talked about buffers. So, you know, the reverse sensitivity kind of factor of some of these developments here not wanting more agricultural activities or also other developments next to them. And also locating nodes close to transport routes, which gives us, you know, this yellow area, which is probably the most suitable for residential development, and the green is the most suitable for food production. So moving through, setting up, using those 3 scenarios that we set up before, and giving them a purpose. So one with housing variety, one with a highly productive land focus, and one with sort of like a compact neighbourhood focus. And moving through and just seeing what those look like. So this is PC69 again. Here we're looking at, you know, actually only 5% of those soils are really good for food production, although you could use, you know, some of these reserves as well. There's also 3 of those business areas placed around the site, and presumably to allow, these are 800-metre or 10-minute walking circles. So it's providing a catchment for those. But if you think about what those might be, they might actually be the same thing repeated 3 times, which is kind of seems a bit of a waste, or they require you to drive to that one because it's slightly different from the one that's next to you. So just a little bit of unpacking to do around those, I guess. And then thinking about the typology again, we're most likely to get a lot of those moving through. Comparing that with scenario A, as I call it, this one's probably going to give us the most variety in housing because it's kind of got that middle density out of all the options. We're starting to increase the amount of food production from 5 now to 16, and we've got more areas for stormwater management. Moving through to the next scenario, which is basically trying to keep off all of that class 2 soils, so a highly productive land focus. We end up with 34% food production and still large areas of reserves and stormwater management. However, we are starting to, our topologies are starting to require greater density. So we're going to have less of these standalone houses. And then moving to the final option, which is very compact. So everything's really walkable and accessed from this main transport network. We've also got the option of having food production connected right through the development. Still a really high amount of food production in there, 32%, and still retaining a lot of that land for stormwater management. However, we are getting into some quite unique typologies for New Zealand, especially in this context. And also remember the unit numbers were less than those other options. So, a few things to work through. So in conclusion, our land is under threat from, our highly productive land is under threat from residential sprawl. The community submissions here show us that a lot of people are strongly opposed to the loss of highly productive land, though there also is support for some alternative models of development, so perhaps not the stuff that we're used to getting. And projects like this suggest it's possible to accommodate both housing and food on those areas of land. There is more study required around the models of farming that might happen on those pieces of land. Is it a farm that's sort of managed by the community, or is it a separate entity that you can work into? Also, a bit of work around testing the appetite for greater densities and, people wanting to live in those kinds of communities where agriculture is a key focus. Yeah, so I was probably a little bit over time. Thank you, guys. This one.
James, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Let me find something to share. That's weird. I can hear myself echoing. Hang on. Share this window.
Until he makes his talk, we'll just leave the.
Can you see that, everybody? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can see it.
Can you see that fine?
All good. We can hear
All
you.
good?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, I'll count down. Then I'll go, shall I? Okay. So, hi, my name's James Eggers. I'm sorry that I have to present online. I'm not feeling that great. But we'll get through this and have some questions at the end, okay? So my research, which I've for my master's, which I've just submitted, is essentially looking at dryland agricultural landscapes and how to best integrate native vegetation into them to provide multiple benefits for livestock and also for native birds, native bush birds. So that's the kind of where we're going. And there's just what we'll get through in the next 15 minutes. But quite a cool quote that I came across was basically showing the importance of trees to us. So essentially without trees, well, we won't be here. So we often forget that. And so it says plant trees for our lives, which is what this is kind of all about. So what's the issue? So New Zealand's got quite a strong agricultural history, and it's one of the sort of factors that we base our economy on. But also habitat loss worldwide is of original vegetation The biggest cause is the removal of original vegetation for agriculture. And in Canterbury, only 5%, 0.5%, sorry, of that vegetation remains. And also coming up against the fact that New Zealand's also been declared a world biodiversity hotspot due to the large number of endemic species that aren't found anywhere else. However, 40% of those species are threatened or at risk. So it's trying to find the balance between continuing to increase food supply while restoring native birds back into the landscape, our agricultural landscapes especially. And the objectives were to investigate, as I said, the native plants that will fulfill multiple functions within the dryland agroecosystems, specifically in Canterbury. And then to investigate spatial layouts on the farm. So we've got a case study of Ashley Dean Dryland Farm that will provide shade and shelter, forage and habitat for Aotearoa, New Zealand, native bush birds. So this was basically set up around 5 different questions. So which native vegetation species best provide forage for livestock within dryland agroecosystems, shade and shelter for livestock, habitat for native bush birds, and then which ones provide multiple benefits for both the livestock and the native bush birds. And then finally, applying it to the case study site, what spatial design strategies for these species will have the greatest potential for multifunctional benefits. So just an overview of the methodology. So it uses a mixed methodology, missed a word out there, but it's basically a case study site and involved visits to habitat restoration sites. So Te Ara Kakariki, which is an organisation that restores native vegetation through the Selwyn district, developing a multifunctional native plant list, and then developing spatial plans or designs for the case study site. Well, I'll just say right here that this research focuses on native plant species or native woody vegetation. That's not to say that exotic species aren't a significant part of agricultural systems, but just for this research, it's focusing on native species. So here's a quick look at the case study site of Ashley Dean Dryland Farm, or depending on what you want to call it. It's Lincoln University owned since 1909. It's a peri-urban location, so about 10 minutes down the road from where you are, and about 4 or 5 minutes from Rolleston, which is quite fast growing, as everyone knows, hopefully. It's got a long history of sheep and pasture research. However, there's minimal water, minimal forage, shade, shelter, and bird habitat on the farm. So it's an ideal kind of case study if you want to make any improvements, because you plant one tree, it's probably going to improve it. And it has been described as a dry, stony desert. So just to get a bit of background, I went and visited over the summer some restoration sites from Te Ara Kakariki, about 20 of them. And that was just to observe plant species, soil moisture, different growth rates, weed control methods and things like that. However, none of them was located within an agricultural system. So this research is sort of taking a novel approach by looking at, like, in a sense, developing one of these inside a working agricultural farm. And then I went on to develop a multifunctional native plant list, which there's a lot of information around, but it's not always consistent or reliable, or a lot of the terms are different, or some are estimates, some are scientifically based. So there's a lot of things. But essentially, I got a list of about 65 native plants with about 30 or 40 different characteristics. And then I assigned scores to each of the characteristics based on the importance of the significance, of achieving the objectives of the research questions. And they had to be plants that really would survive in a dryland environment. It's one of the key things. And here's just an example of 3 plants. So we've got the kofi, the old cabbage tree, the New Zealand cabbage tree, and the Olearia adenocarpa, which is the Canterbury shrub daisy. And if you take the bottom sort of row and put it up on the right, this is a lot of the characteristics that were looked at. And then these were assigned, the numbers were assigned based on expert opinion and, like I said, the resources that were found. Once the plant lists were developed, so there was the 4 there on the left, that was put through a filter of sort of the site, context, the literature, and then a design process to come up with 3 different designs. And then at the intersection of them all was the combined multifunctional design. So the first one was to look at the top plants for to enhance forage. So it was looking at palatability, defoliation, tolerance, growth rate, and any toxic elements within the plants. And then on the right-hand side of the table, you can see a total. So obviously, silver tussock, wineberry, karamu, they were the highest, most suitable plants for forage from the research. And then I formed 3 potential configurations of what that may look like. And then I put them onto, based on the site context, onto the site farm, onto the case study, sorry. Essentially putting them in areas where they'd be most required or most useful. Then we found the top plants that provide shade and shelter in dryland areas. So they're bigger, taller trees generally. And then I developed 3 different layouts. So in paddock, meandering, and straight shelter. And once again, I placed them onto the case study site and where they would be most useful, especially, so the 4 factors were the predominant northeast wind, the hot, dry northwest wind, and the cold southwest wind. And then obviously in the southern hemisphere, the sun goes across the north. So that's to provide shade. And then the birds and the native bird habitat plants. So we looked at the number of food sources that each plant will provide, and then did a bit of a objective or subjective, classification of quality of nesting sites with Dr. Colin Merck, and that's where we got these from. And then just to step back a wee bit, just to justify putting a green dot, as they call it, is a bigger map of the wider area of Te Ara Kakariki green dots with little restoration sites, and Ashley Dean is located in one of these areas. Bing, right there. And it's also along the optimum biodiversity corridor along the Waikirikiri Selwyn River. So it's right in the hot spot, right in a good spot for one. So where on the farm it came to next should the habitat patch of about 6.5 hectares go. So I chose 5 areas with sort of different characteristics, and then did a SWOT analysis on each. And the final decision came to use site E. Basically, because it was in the south of the farm, it was at the headwaters of a stream running into the Selwyn River, and it was downhill from any water that had to be pumped from the well. So with the lower cost and ease of irrigating new plantings. I developed a quick concept plan here with a little corridor through the middle where the drainage would go. And if we look the next page, so 3 different areas that I looked in on. So they probably don't show as much because they're just all trees, but the one on the top right essentially shows an insect corridor when water fills up that area. And the one on the bottom left shows the existing poplars, which are the light green ones, and they're in pretty bad condition, so some of them are falling over and so on. So all good stuff for attracting insects, which attract insectivorous bush birds, such as your fantail, waka waka. And then came up with the final bush bird habitat design. So there's the initial patch, which we just talked about, put a secondary one over here, about 950 meters away, and then a tertiary patch up in this corner. And they're all connected by a corridor of vegetated corridors. And then finally, the multifunctional productive landscape. So putting all of that together to get the top best trees in the world in New Zealand, which we've found here, as you can see. And then layering up these three designs that we've just previously mentioned. And if there are any unclear spatial decisions, are based on the priority for native bush birds, because they need a bit of help out there in the agricultural landscapes, need a bit more help than the sheep or livestock that are already there. And then this is the final combination. So includes all 9 of the previous planting configurations and also combinations of each one, including forage plantings in shaded areas or habitat patches with forage plantings around the edge, those sort of things. And it also, because it's a Lincoln University owned farm, there's a wide range of different planting and tree configurations and so on. So you could compare, say, a traditional sheep farm, and next door will be a regenerative or a silver pasture or agroforestry or whatever, all next to each other, and then you could get some good scientific evidence based on similar soils being in the same area for 2 different types of farming, if that makes sense. Did a SWOT analysis, but just some highlights here is essentially the overall redesign allows for multiple ecosystem benefits that balance agricultural and ecological objectives. However, with 95% of native trees and shrubs being evergreen, some of these areas may be shaded out all year round, and frosts and so on may be prolonged throughout the day. There's a good opportunity to include restoration for other landowners, because they'll see an example over their fence, for example, of a habitat site working within an agricultural system, and they might, that might incentivize them. And I couldn't really think of any threats, but I just threw this one in there because then there'd be a T with nothing else. Basically, if you're putting big trees around, it might shade the neighbours, which around the I can't my hands trying to describe it with my hands. All the properties surrounding it are essentially irrigated dairy or sheep farms, so that would increase water retention. So the discussion of which ones are the best for forage within the dryland agroecosystem. So they're consistent with the literature. However, much of it is based on expert knowledge. There is potential for native trees and shrubs to be used as forage, but there is quite a big knowledge gap in this area with a lot of research required. Which ones are the best for shade and shelter? So they vary in their ability. The variation occurs over time because some New Zealand plants take a long time to mature. Taller, faster, exotic growing species, which we haven't looked at here, but they provide greater levers quicker, if you like. And native species may have the ability to enhance native biodiversity and species richness. That is debatable. Food sources are generally provided by native species are generally well understood. There's lots of brochures and so on out there about what birds like to eat. However, further work is required to categorise the quality of nesting sites. And the distance between nesting sites and food also requires further investigation. And some of the conclusions that came up with were native tree and shrub species have a potential to enhance the multifunctionality of Aotearoa New Zealand's dryland agroecosystems. More work's required on the use of native trees and shrubs as forage. Combining exotic and native vegetation may have the best overall outcomes. and there's an opportunity to investigate a more robust system of categorizing plant characteristics. And multifunctional landscapes increase overall health, and they're great for everybody, and everyone wins, and it's great. So let's do it. And I'd just like to thank these wonderful people here, Shannon, Cryle, Colin and Pablo, and the others who know who they are, and my wife and children who are down the other end of the house trying to be quiet. Thank you.
Thank you, James.